The real Achilles heel of the sleeve gastrectomy, and the only significant long-term complication that we really see after this otherwise fantastic and very safe procedure, is long-term heartburn or gastroesophageal reflux disease, sometimes referred to as GERD. So first, let's talk about what GERD is, because I find a lot of times people don't quite understand it. It really is the exact same thing as heartburn. And I use the two terms interchangeably. From a medical perspective, you can talk about how the lining of the esophagus is different versus heartburn being a symptom, and there is some subtleties to it. But when you're trying to interpret the difference between GERD and heartburn, for all intents and purposes, it is the same thing. And what it really means is that acid, which is in the stomach, can reflux up into the esophagus, and the esophagus is not well designed to handle acid. The esophagus is lined with one type of lining, and this is going to become important in a second, and the stomach is lined with a very acid resistant. And right here at the junction, we have the junction between the lining of the esophagus and the lining of the stomach. So this is acid resistant, and this is acid sensitive. So when acid is exposed to the lining of the esophagus, it irritates it, and the symptom that we experience is a burning in the chest, sometimes even into the back, and it can be very unpleasant. And after a sleeve, you develop worse heartburn for two main reasons. The first is that the pressure inside the stomach increases. So we have more pressure, and that pressure is pushing it back up against the flow of gravity into the esophagus. So that higher pressure in a sleeve, and this has been measured and shown that there's much higher pressure in a sleeve stomach than there is in a normal size stomach. So that higher pressure pushes the acid up into the esophagus. The second reason is when we do this surgery, there's some attachments right here that attach the esophagus and the top part of the stomach to the diaphragm, and that tends to kink and create a valve function right here at that junction between the esophagus and the stomach, and that valve will prevent the reflux of acid. So when we do the surgery to remove the stomach, and when you do a sleeve, this is the most critical portion of the stomach to really get a good sleeve on, that you want to make sure you don't leave extra tissue. And in order to do that, you have to take down all of these attachments, which help to establish this reflux valve that prevents GERD or heartburn. So to do a good sleeve, we have to divide those, and there's really no way to reconstruct them so that they work like they did before. As surgeons, we're just no match for nature and evolution and the way our body was created. So it's not a simple matter of just kind of recreating this. There are some things that we can do, I'll talk about in just a second, but in essence, we are disrupting this valve. So on one hand, we increase the pressure, and then also we decrease the function of the valve, and those two together can cause heartburn. Now, it is very common after surgery, but most patients do not experience it. Only 25% of patients will develop worsening heartburn symptoms after a sleeve. The other 75% are either better or, in often cases, have improved heartburn. Why is this? Why are some people experiencing heartburn and others not? We don't know. And I'm actually part of a research project where we're looking at the videos of surgeons and seeing if there's any subtleties in the difference in technique that we can use to help determine which patients have heartburn and which don't, because there actually is a variation from surgeon to surgeon in terms of heartburn. What's interesting is there's not a lot of variation in terms of weight loss. You look at one surgeon versus the other surgeon, and you really don't see much different in the amount of weight their patients are losing. But when we look at heartburn, there is a difference where some surgeons have a higher incidence of heartburn than others after these surgeries. And exactly what that is, we're trying to figure out. There's a lot of theories. A lot of them have to do with this angle. If you make it too narrow down at the bottom, at this angle that I've talked about in some of the other videos where it can kink or twist, that can increase the pressure. That's one theory. Some other theories are in terms of how you handle some of those valve tissues, whether you leave some in place or you take them all down. And that is also, again, these are all theories, but we really don't have any science to explain why some people get heartburn and others don't. The treatment for this is typically lifelong medication, and it's a proton pump inhibitor like Protonix or Prilosec or Nexium. There's now 6 or 7 or even more of these out there, and you could end up having a lifelong dependency on these medications to help control your acid reflux. The overwhelming majority of patients who have acid reflux after a sleeve either have relatively mild symptoms where they only need to take this medication, this proton pump inhibitor, when they're having symptoms, or have kind of moderate disease where if they take it on a daily basis, they can keep it well controlled. But if they don't take it, then they have significant symptoms. But there is a small group, around 2 or 3% of people, who will have very severe reflux where even on the max dose of these medications still have significant symptoms. Oftentimes when you're in this group, you also do have some degree of frequent vomiting, and whether it's from the acid reflux or this is a kinked or twisted sleeve that's causing some backflow of the acid and increased pressure in the stomach up into the esophagus, we don't really know. But I've noticed that there is, in those patients with really severe acid reflux, that there also is some component of obstruction there too. And I have another video that talks about obstruction after a sleeve, which is thankfully very uncommon, but it does occur. So around 2 to 3% of patients who have a sleeve will develop such severe acid reflux that they will require revision to a gastric bypass. The good news is that this is curative, that the acid reflux disappears and any of the negative consequences of this chronic and severe acid reflux will essentially go back to normal. So on one hand, yes, it's terrible to have a complication like severe acid reflux, and if you're unfortunate enough to be in that small percentage of patients who have it, then that really is terrible. However, there is a cure, there is a treatment. You have to have a surgery which you did not originally sign up for, but at least there's something that can be offered. So I think that's an important thing just to keep in mind when we look at heartburn, is that it is treatable. For most cases, it requires lifelong dependency on a medication, but in some rare circumstances, it can require another surgery. Now, when we do sleeve gastrectomies, it's very common for us to repair a hiatal hernia. And what a hiatal hernia is normally if we have our diaphragm here, the esophagus comes down, and even the bottom part of the esophagus is in the abdominal cavity. So here's the stomach. This is normal, where we have the entire stomach, and this is abdomen, and this is chest. So the diaphragm is this muscular, large muscle that basically separates your body from a chest cavity into an abdominal cavity. And it flexes and opens, and that's how we breathe. So what a hiatal hernia is where the stomach is herniated up above the diaphragm. So the junction here between the esophagus and the stomach is up in the chest, where here the junction is down in the abdomen. And this is called a hiatal hernia. And what we do during a sleeve gastrectomy is if we see a small one, or even a decent sized one, we can pull the stomach down into the chest and then suture this diaphragm muscle back together to reestablish this opening. It takes about 15 minutes extra, and it really does not add a tremendous amount of risk to the procedure. And we do it to help prevent long-term acid reflux, and this is essentially the one thing that surgeons can do, is to help reestablish that valve, because if that valve is up in the chest, it doesn't work nearly as well as when it's in the abdomen. So this is the one thing surgeons can do to help ensure that the valve continues to function after a sleeve gastrectomy. The frequency of performing a hiatal hernia is actually very surgeon dependent. There are some surgeons who will repair any tiny little hernia, and if you really think about it, hernia means that the stomach could potentially slide up, that the diaphragm opening is just a little bit bigger than the esophagus, so it could slide up. Everybody has an opening because the esophagus must come through. How big that opening is one that's really left to judgment, and when we're in the operating room we can kind of look at it, but the idea that we could somehow measure or quantify this in a very objective way is just not really how it works or how it looks. And because tissue, if you If you kind of move it or clean off some things, it can change the shape. And oftentimes you can almost create a small hiatal hernia just by cleaning off some of this surrounding tissue. You can see it kind of open up. So it is very, very subjective, and you will see some surgeons who repair this 75% of the time, and you have other surgeons who repair it 15% of the time, and we really don't know what the right amount is. And it's really, to some degree, speaks to the difficulty in studying surgery, because there's so many variables and so much so much subtlety to it, that even though we've done hundreds and hundreds of thousands, probably close to 1 million sleeves in this country, we still don't know the answer. Who's right? The surgeon who repairs a hiatal hernia 85% of the time, or the one who repairs it 15% of the time? Why does one surgeon have a 30 or 40% rate of heartburn and another surgeon have a 10 or 15% rate of heartburn? Why are these things happening? We don't know. We're starting to collect videos and study them and create these objective measures to figure that out. But it's a really big process and very complicated, and I'm grateful to be part of a research protocol that I think we're going to make some headway on in the next year or so. But even as we're reviewing a lot of the initial results, it's not overwhelmingly obvious what's causing this. Another thing is, we typically, and my practice is to perform an endoscopy before every patient, on every patient that I do a sleeve gastrectomy on. A gastric bypass, I think there's some variability there. It doesn't always have to be done. But with a sleeve gastrectomy, I really think it should be done on every patient, for what I'm going to talk about in the next slide, to make sure that we aren't putting a patient in a really unfortunate position. But even at endoscopy, when we're looking, because endoscopy, we're looking from the inside. So basically the camera's right here, we're looking at it, but the hiatal hernia is really here on the outside. So we're just kind of seeing the indentations. Again, it's very subjective, and it's not that easy sometimes to find these small hiatal hernias. So I've done endoscopies on patients and thought, oh, it doesn't look like there's a hiatal hernia at all. And then I went into the surgery and it looked like there was a substantial one. And we had to repair it. So this is something that is often done. It's something you can discuss with your surgeon. If they do say you have a small hiatal hernia, they do go ahead and repair it. It really isn't going to change much in terms of your postoperative outcomes or your risk. And just know that your surgeon was trying to prevent heartburn as a long-term complication for you. So the real difficult condition that we must be aware of if we're proceeding with a sleeve or we're undergoing a sleeve is a condition called Barrett's esophagus. And well, normally we have the lining of the stomach kind of stays in the stomach at this junction between the stomach and the esophagus. When it's exposed to chronic acid, that it can essentially start to change the lining of the esophagus to something that it can resemble stomach, but it often resembles small intestine. And it's essentially your body's defense mechanism in an attempt to prevent this injury that's happening from constant exposure of the esophageal lining to acid. The problem is, and this is called Barrett's esophagus, and it's a change in the lining of your esophagus, and it's usually in the very distant, like the last part, the last inch or two of the esophagus, that we see this change. It doesn't happen up in the middle or the top part of the chest unless it's incredibly awful and severe, but that's very rare and usually speaks to something else that's pretty significant going on. The big issue with Barrett's esophagus is twofold. First is it's a pre-malignant condition, meaning that if you have Barrett's esophagus, you have a higher risk of developing esophageal cancer compared to someone who does not. Now, how much higher is that risk? It's a lot higher. It can be 10 or 20 times higher. And there's a progression of Barrett's, and we can kind of measure it from mild and early Barrett's all the way to severe or right on the edge of cancer. And when it's right on the edge of cancer, we typically treat it like cancer. We've got some new techniques where we can kind of burn off the lining and it'll grow back normal. However, if you have chronic acid exposure, that won't last for long. And really, that only works when you remove the chronic acid exposure. So if you have Barrett's esophagus, you cannot have a sleeve gastrectomy. And the reason for this is that first, we run the risk of increasing or worsening the progression. Barrett's esophagus, like I said, is a spectrum, and you go from mild to more severe and ultimately to cancer. And if we perform a sleeve, we know that this will increase your risk of developing Barrett's esophagus in general. And so you don't want to take someone who has known Barrett's esophagus and to expose them to a risk of developing esophageal cancer. So patients with Barrett's should absolutely, under no circumstances, undergo a sleeve gastrectomy. And there are a few surgeons out there who will kind of push this a little bit and have some rationalization for it. But when we look at the consensus statement from the leaders in our field, it really is clear this is not something that should be done. The second reason why you don't want to do a sleeve gastrectomy in someone with Barrett's esophagus is that the portion of the stomach, if let's say, God forbid, you went on to develop esophageal cancer and needed surgery to remove that portion of the esophagus, the surgery to remove that portion of the esophagus uses the part of the stomach that we've removed by doing a sleeve. So this is really kind of a 1-2 punch in terms of how doing a sleeve on a patient with Barrett's esophagus can predispose you to additional risk. Number one, it can make it more likely that you develop cancer. And then if you do develop cancer, the surgery to remove your esophagus becomes much more complicated because the normal way we do it can't be done because that portion of the stomach has been removed. So if you have Barrett's esophagus, under no circumstances should you have a sleeve gastrectomy done. The big question, and I think if we ever do, and remember the sleeve's only about 10 years old, if we ever do identify that the sleeve was probably not a great option for people undergoing weight loss, it will either be from weight regain, which will be the subject of another video, or because we see a high incidence of the development of Barrett's esophagus and ultimately esophageal cancer. This is an unknown. This is something that could take 20 or 30 years, but if you're having the surgery when you're 35 years old, you're going to be alive when the risks of this increased acid exposure and increased GERD or heartburn comes to fruition, and you develop Barrett's esophagus, which could potentially go on to become esophageal cancer. So the incidence in the research is somewhere between 1% and 7%, but we really have very, very few long-term, high-quality studies of patients who've undergone sleeve gastrectomy at 10 and 15 years out because we just haven't been doing the surgery in any kind of reasonable volume for that long. So in my mind, the big question mark about the long-term safety of a sleeve gastrectomy is, does it expose people to an increased risk of Barrett's esophagus and therefore an increased risk of esophageal cancer? And we don't know the answer. I can't in any way condemn it, and I do offer sleeve gastrectomies to my patients, but I do mention that this is something that we don't know about. I could be completely wrong and we really don't see a lot of esophageal cancer, or there could be a lot of issues down the road and this could turn into kind of a public health disaster. So the bottom line is that heartburn and a sleeve gastrectomy is a common complication. It's typically mild and can be well controlled with really over-the-counter proton pump inhibitor medication. However, this risk of Barrett's esophagus is something that we all have to recognize is an unknown where we don't really know what the long-term impact will be.